Fullerman,
Present.
Representative Allred,
Here.
Representative Banks,
Here.
Representative Conrad,
Here.
Representative Crago,
Here.
Representative Davis,
Here.
Representative Slagle,
Present.
Representative Winter,
Here.
Chairman Eklund.
Here.
Thank you.
All right, last meeting, we were on House Bill 22, and we had received testimony on the bill, and we closed the testimony and began working the bill. And we have a proposed amendment. You ready for that?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. From Representative Crago.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I laid a copy of this amendment on everyone's desk here this morning, and I also circulated it via email last week before we all went home. I've provided a copy of the proposed amendment to the Office of State Lands, the Governor's Office, and I believe I also sent a copy maybe to the Stock Growers Association for their input. And I have extra copies, a couple extra, if anybody in the audience would like one. Essentially, what this amendment does is divide the contested versus uncontested, separates the timelines for the two different types of renewals, and then also made sure that if it is a contested renewal, that they have some sort of cure process similar to the non or uncontested renewals. The timelines don't match up exactly because I tried to keep it on a shorter timeline for the Office of State Lands because they're under a time crunch once we go to contested. And so it's not exactly the same, but it still allows for a cure process. And I would be, I'd move that amendment, Mr. Chairman, to House Bill 22.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Seconded by Winter. Go ahead,
And
Representative.
Mr. Chairman, I believe the Office of State Lands maybe had a few comments on this particular amendment. I know they had sent me an email if you want to hear from them.
Yeah. Jason, will you come on up?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. I'm Jason Crowder, Deputy Director for the Office of State Lands and Investments. We appreciate this opportunity to talk further about the bill and the opportunity to discuss the amendment with Representative Crago and with you all. I think the amendment does a good job of clarifying a few things and also, as Representative Crago mentioned, separating the two processes, which is important to decrease confusion among applicants who are involved in this process or find themselves involved in the process. The concern that we found or the comments that we provided Representative Crago back simply revolve around on the amendment, it's line 18, but the deletion of the word complete. We asked for that word to be inserted during the interim because simply we need to have some, I guess, backdrop to measure an application against. There are times when we don't receive complete applications when we ask for them to respond to a conflicting application. And we needed something that just told the applicant, you have a performance measure here. You need to ensure that you provide the office with a complete application, meaning everything in it is filled out and we don't have any question. And then we also asked during the interim to make sure that the payment also comes along with that application so that there's a real clear playing field or a clear rule that those applicants who are responding to a conflicting application know. That's a provision that we copy and paste into our notices so that they know exactly with the teeth of statute or the enforcement of statute what they need to do. So we would ask that word stay in there just so that that rule or that performance measure is still there. The other comment we made to Representative Crago was simply that the amendment appears to provide, and it's a good thing, you should provide some ability for the for an existing lessee to respond to a conflicting application and ensure that we can talk to them and have a communication that that application is valid, it's complete, and it's something that we can use. The amendment allows the same grace period as we do with a normal renewal application, meaning that if it's deficient, we give them 30 days to clean up that deficiency. We don't give that same consideration to a conflicting applicant. They are stuck with a 30-day time period, that's it. If their application is deficient at the end of that initial 30-day time period, there's no chance to cure or correct. And so we just wanted to highlight for the committee that we're in this amendment, there is an accommodation or possibly an advantage granted to that existing applicant above that of a conflicting applicant. And I'm not sure if that's the intent of the committee or of the amendment, but just wanted to highlight that aspect for you. And then the last thing was simply that if all the timelines are run through, just like I had described to you in the timeline I had provided, and if that application receives a director's decision, we have to provide at least 30 days for that director's decision to be appealed. Typically, we don't get those appeals until the end of the 30-day time period because they are organizing themselves, they're seeking legal counsel, they're ensuring that they can do everything they can to have an appropriate and accurate appeal that has some chance of success or something we can move forward with. If they go through that whole process, the deadlines and the timeframes Representative Crago mentioned go past the expiration date of the lease. We do everything in our office and move as quickly as we can to have all of these situations cleaned up so that we know how the lease sits, who the lessee should be prior to it expiring. If for whatever reason it goes past the expiration date, we get into some weirdness of, do we have a valid lease that we can utilize? Who can utilize that? Is the director's decision guiding? And we don't believe it is. We believe the Board of Land Commissioners' decision and ratification of that director's decision is guiding. So we want to stay away from that situation as much as possible. And the timelines within the amendment do possibly push those timelines past the expiration date of the lease. Mr. Chairman, that's everything that we had prepared for the amendment. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Go ahead, Representative Crago.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Crowder, if we were to change, at one point I had thought about, it's on line 28 and 29 of the amendment. I had thought about making that 20 days to respond instead of 30. I mean, would those extra 10 days make a difference? I think, and doing the math in my head, obviously buys us 10 extra days, but I think it actually keeps us within that. It would allow for the 30 days following that for the director to, for the appeal following the director's decision. Is that fair? Does that make
Mr.
sense?
Chairman, yeah, Representative Crago, I think you're right. I think that moves it right to the anniversary or the expiration date of the lease.
Go ahead.
So would that be a helpful amendment to the amendment or friendly amendment in your mind?
Mr. Chairman, it does fit with our attempt to clean up the lease as much, or have the lease positioned in a way that we know possibly who the next lessee is prior to the expiration date.
Then will that clear up your concerns on the amendment toward the bill? Other than the complete part, we haven't discussed that yet, the word complete.
And Mr. Chairman, it clears up the timing piece of it.
Okay.
The advantage provided to an existing lessee is still there, and as you mentioned, complete, the word complete is still there.
All right, let's have a little discussion on the word complete, whether it stays in or comes out.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The reason I had deleted the word complete from the bill draft was just to delineate the fact that we're allowing for a cure process, whether it stays in or not. I'm not sure it really matters because we still are allowing for a cure process. We're saying, yes, you have to submit a complete, which that's I would assume you'd have to submit a complete application anyways, but then we're saying if it's not complete, that's why we're allowing for this 20-day cure process set forth down in the bottom part of the amendment. And so, to be honest with you, I'm indifferent on whether or not that word stays in. I took it out on purpose because I didn't want us to have conflicting ideas on what this amendment was trying to do. We're trying to allow for a cure process. So if the word complete stays in my mind, I don't think it matters. And if that makes them feel more secure and allows them to actually send out language on notices in accordance with the statute, it's probably okay.
Okay, a question that I guess I would have. We had testimony last week in which a renewal application was submitted and the check had been left out, I think. So it wasn't a complete lease renewal application. If we remove that word, then I am convinced they can go through a cure process to fix it, to fix that, to come back into compliance. If we leave complete in there, are we still allowed to use the cure process to allow that applicant to come back into compliance?
Mr. Chairman, I believe so. If you keep that portion of the amendment, you're correct. I think in our office, we would read that as we would expect a complete application to come in. However, if it's not, then we have a cure process to fix that deficiency. Our recommendation to Representative Crago was to reinsert the word complete and to strike the whole of that portion of the amendment. That would align with how the provision had previously read. And we agree with Representative Crago that removing the word complete and then adding a cure process also fits or is understandable.
Okay. Representative Crago.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Crowder, so just because I'm a little confused with your last statement, removing the word complete and allowing for the cure process aligns with the other process, but if we put the word complete back in, are you saying we also need to remove the cure process that we've proposed in this amendment?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Crago, I don't think you have to. It was our attempt to provide you with a way to counter the concern, if it is a concern of yours, of providing an advantage to an existing lessee that the conflicting applicant does not have. That was simply it.
Go ahead, Representative.
Just a little discussion, Mr. Chairman. I mean, I think that's the idea, is we're trying to allow for protection of the renewal application. They do have preference in other areas of this very statutory sections. And so I think that was the idea, is we don't want somebody on a renewal because, for example, as we heard testimony last week, somebody forgets to put a check in the mail. The application is 100% complete, except they forgot to include the check and it's laying on the countertop at home. I think that was my attempt, was to make sure that doesn't happen to somebody. And so, yes, I think they're in a different circumstance.
Any further discussion, committee? Thank you.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I had one more comment that
Okay, go
I
ahead.
forgot. The amendment strikes the change to the due date for the annual payment, places it back on the anniversary date of the lease. We are okay with that and don't see any impacts with it. As we discussed last time, we were simply trying to marry up two processes as closely as possible to decrease confusion, but this is a fine way to do it for our office, and we certainly can do that. The only thing that I might add is if the amendment is approved to remove that changing of due dates, that perhaps we go back to the 30-day notice and not the 60-day notice. One of the things that we hear in our office often is that the notice happens so far before the deadline that they forget what the deadline is and perhaps forget to perform to it. So just give that to the committee for your consideration of moving the notice piece from our office to the applicant of their annual payment from 60 days back to 30 days.
Questions, committee? Okay. Thank you. All right. Are there any proposed amendments to the amendment? Representative Craigo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The only change I'd like to make is on lines 28 and 29, where it says 30 and has the 30 in parentheses there, the numbers 30 in parentheses, change that to 20.
Okay. Committee understand that, and then it will leave 10 days after 10 days to correct any deficiencies, correct? All right. Is there a second to the,
Second.
all right. So we'll vote on the, Mark, do you have that? The amendment to the amendment is 20 days from receipt of the notice.
On line 29,
Yeah,
strike 30 and insert 20.
yep.
Okay.
Well, and yeah, and then there's 30. On 28 has to be changed to 20. Okay,
Yes,
committee clear?
that's it.
All right. I
Pardon
think
me.
Sensing we're ready to vote, we're voting on,
Mr. Chairman?
yes, sir.
So the
Mark.
two changes are 28, change the written out 30 to 20, and the numerical on 29 from 30 to 20, and that's the only two changes in this amendment.
Yes.
Okay?
So we'll be voting on the amendment as it is with that amended change. Now, maybe I need some help on my Robert's rules. Do we have to vote on the amended change, or we've just changed it? Okay.
Mr. Chairman, we could do it one of two ways. I just
Okay.
propose we do a friendly amendment to the amendment and does not require a vote.
That is,
Mr.
go
Chairman,
ahead.
are we voting on changing the amendment, or are we voting to approve the amendment
I think we're,
with the
let's just
change?
vote on the amended change. And then we'll vote on the, amendment.
Okay, thank
That's
you.
clear to me. Okay with everyone? All right. We're voting on the amended change, which I presume was seconded. Did somebody second? Okay, we got a second on it. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Any further changes then? All right, we are ready to vote on this amended amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, that amendment passes. Are we ready to vote on the bill? I believe we are. Roll call, please.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
if I may ask, is there any public testimony related to the bill, or with the new amendment?
Normally we, I think probably not. We worked that thing pretty thoroughly on Friday, and it does change it a little bit, but we don't usually allow public testimony in unless it'll benefit the discussion on the bill. And I think we're ready to vote. We've spent a lot of time on this thing.
This is voting on House Bill 22. Representative Alleman,
Aye.
Representative Allred,
Aye.
Representative Banks,
Aye.
Representative Conrad,
Aye.
Representative Craigo,
Aye.
Representative Davis,
Aye.
Representative Slagle,
Aye.
Representative Winter,
Aye.
Chairman Eklund.
Aye.
Ayes are 9, noes are 0. Bill passes with amendments.
Okay, we're now ready for House Bill 20, land exchanges priority. And I think I'll have State Lands come up and explain the bill, and we'll have public testimony on this one.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Deputy Director Jason Crowder, Office of State Lands and Investments. Make sure your handouts are coming. Mr. Chairman, House Bill 20 is a direction to the Board of Land Commissioners and the Office of State Lands and Investments to do a couple things when considering land transactions and specifically land exchanges. The first thing that it does is require a public notice piece to specific entities when the office and the board are analyzing transactions, and specifically before it can affect or effectuate any exchange, it must go through a public notice piece. The public notice is that it provides interested persons the ability to provide comments. Those interested persons include leaseholders of the state lands to be exchanged, the owners of adjoining lands, county commissioners, and state legislators within the affected county. This is an existing process within the office, so I'm not sure that this bill or the insertion of this part of the bill really cleans anything up. Prior to the office publishing what we call a detailed analysis, we do send notice to all of these affected parties, with the exception of adjoining landowners. That would be a new addition, and we could easily put that in our current practice of setting that out. But we push that out through a Gov delivery notice. We put notice on our website as well. We provide a copy of that detailed analysis with the notice. We send it to the local library in the county that's affected so that they can have a hard copy for the public to see as they walk in. And we also send a copy of that to the county assessor. Just trying to make sure everybody in the county understands what the board is looking at as it moves forward in its deliberation. So, Mr. Chairman, that's the first part of the bill, is to require that public notice. And again, it is an existing practice of our office. Mr. Chairman, go ahead.
Deputy Director, so that portion of the change could be left out of the bill. It's already in practice. Is it in rules or is it in statute?
Mr. Chairman, the existing statute requires that we conduct land transactions in consultation with the county commissioners. So that's a base requirement. It also requires a public hearing if the county commissioners request. The Board of Land Commissioners went a little bit further with that and requires a 30-day public comment period along with a public hearing. We've extended that through rule to 60 days. So that part is codified in rule. The notification, as we do and have done for several years, at least 10 to my memory, is something that's not required in rule or statute. It's just normal practice of the program to move forward.
But this would add it to statute as well. Okay. Any questions, committee? Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, the bill also adds a new subsection B to the statute that kind of explains how the board and the office are to look at land exchanges and to analyze them. I had provided the committee with a handout and added another page to it today. The first page is the 1997 session laws, and it gives guidance for you, and specifically it gives guidance to us and the board as we are moving through land transactions and specific things that we are to look for as we go through that. What came out of the 1997 session law was the trust land management objectives, and that's the second handout that I provided you. The Board of Land Commissioners ratified those or approved those to be a measure for all land transactions, sales, acquisitions, and exchanges, as well as any long-term leasing that the board might entertain, that the office go through that set of criteria and provide answers to those questions to the board as it ultimately approves or disapproves any application. That has been in place since 2005. We utilize those trust land and management objectives every day. In fact, the detailed analysis that I explained earlier is predicated on those. The detailed analysis clearly explains every aspect of the land exchange, the private property that we would acquire, the state land that we would dispose, how that transaction specifically meets all of those objectives. And as you can read in the objectives, they are listed in priority order. So the first is an investment objective. How does the transaction meet or exceed current investment returns from owning the parcel as well as revenue derived from use of the parcel. The second is manageability of the parcel. Can we leverage sister agency resources or public resources or private resources to aid in the management of those parcels? And a lot of that comes in consolidating land ownership patterns. We've recognized we gain a great efficiency when we consolidate ownership into one block rather than having the scattered parcels as we sometimes have across the state. And the third is, how does the transaction meet a community need? How does it benefit a school placement? How does it benefit maybe a community growth? We have a community in the state that is landlocked by federal land and state land, and we've discussed often with them of doing some kind of exchange where that state land could become private and perhaps that community could grow. And so that would meet that objective. Also, public access is where is placed in that objective as well. How do we increase public accessible acreage and increase the experience of public use on those lands? So I wanted to provide those handouts to you so that you know really the rule book and the playing field that we go by when we look at all of those transactions, and that it's been a long evolving process to get to where we are today. One thing that the new subsection B does is it provides new criteria above those that I just explained and above those that are already in subsection A. For those of you who don't have the green books in front of you, I wanted to provide the Romanettes that are currently within subsection A, and they are criteria in existing statute, and the sentence specifically says, state lands may be exchanged upon the board's finding the exchange is necessary to, and these are the Romanettes underneath that sentence. Necessary to make state lands more manageable where the lands are not otherwise manageable. Necessary to meet the specific need of a school or community for land, necessary to better meet the multiple use objectives for the benefit of the trust, or necessary to realize a clear long-term benefit to the trust which substantially exceeds the present and probable future benefit from continued ownership. So as you can see, Mr. Chairman, what is already in statute are those Romanettes. The trust land management objectives that the board approved in 2005 are written from those Romanettes, as well as the guidance given to us in the 1997 session law. The addition of Romanet B with its own set of Romanettes makes it a little unclear to us as far as the priority or the instruction that the legislature is given to the office and the board when it's trying to determine which transactions to adhere to. Specifically, we don't know if this is a priority instruction. We don't know if it's intended to be a tiebreaker with competing applications are received on the same parcel, or if it's simply additional criteria to those Romanettes that I just read in subsection A. The new criteria, again, follows the trust land management objectives to some extent, with the exception that it adds wholly within the same county. We do analyze that portion of a transaction inside the detailed analysis as well, and we do it from the standpoint of the tax and impact to those counties. Obviously, state lands are not subject to ad valorem taxes, and so we understand that when you go from state ownership to private ownership or vice versa, there's an impact to the county tax base, and so we want to make sure we understand that. And we try to prioritize those transactions that are wholly within a county, just from that impact standpoint, that hopefully it's a wash. However, the guidance that is given to us by the trust land management objectives, by those first set of Romanettes in subsection A, and by the 1997 session laws, really kind of put a lens on the transactions have to meet a trust benefit and not simply a public benefit. And we feel the addition of subsection B may start shifting that focus from the trust benefit to more of a public benefit or an adjoining landowner benefit, or possibly even a popularity contest. In subsection B, the new Romanet 4 provides a priority criteria of an exchange that receives express support from any interested party, including leaseholders, adjoining landowners, county commissioners, and state legislators. there will always be an interested party who is supportive of these transactions, and we feel that's the applicant. Otherwise, they wouldn't be providing the application to us. So it may not may prioritize all the transactions we're doing, which means it doesn't prioritize any of the transactions we're doing, and we see that as a confusing part of the bill. Mr. Chairman, let me read through my notes real quick to make sure I've gone through everything. The other part of adding subsection B is a timing confusion. It contemplates that we have already understood the benefits of a particular transaction or exchange may have to the first set of Romanettes in subsection A. And after we have understood those, we can apply the second set of Romanettes in subsection B. I will tell you that this is a timing problem. We don't fully understand how a transaction may meet those benefits or not benefit the first set of Romanettes in A because we haven't completed the detailed analysis at this point. That is like I mentioned, the need and the meaning of that detailed analysis is to clearly dig into each one of those Romanettes and the trust land management objectives and clearly analyze them and put them down on paper for public consumption and the board's consumption and ours as well as we determine if they meet those objectives or not. We may not fully understand if they meet any of those until we complete that detailed analysis. So it may be hard for us to prioritize the new set of Romanettes if we don't have the detailed analysis done at that point. What the bill does do, and we're appreciative of, is it doesn't put a clear thou shall imposition on the board or the office. It does keep it at analyze these things, and we appreciate that to keep the discretion at the board's level, but find some confusion within the bill. And Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Committee questions? Okay. Yeah. Go ahead, Representative Davis.
Director, this process that we're talking about here, what's the time period usually for one of these exchanges to take? And the second part of the question is, do you use outside consultants in your evaluation on this process?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Davis, that's a good question. And there's not a set time period because each transaction is unique and completely separate from one another. So there's no set, this takes 30 days, this takes 15 days, this takes 20 days. It depends on the complexity of the transaction. A lot of the work that we do is predicated on the appraisal of the property, and that is dependent on the complexity of the transaction, how in-depth or what type of appraisal is needed to complete that. Once we get the appraisal done and we start writing the detailed analysis, again, the complexity of the transaction bleeds into that. And how long or how much do we need to analyze and how deep do we need to go in each one of the aspects, and that takes time. The one thing that does remain the same is that there is a 60-day public comment period, and there is a public hearing within that 60-day public comment period. So we have at least 60 days on top of all of the other unknowns, I suppose. And after that, the Board of Land Commissioners can take just about as much time as they need to consider the transaction and hear it in an open public meeting. And oftentimes, if there's a lot of interest in it, they may take several open public meetings to understand fully what the public feels and digest that with the detailed analysis moving forward. So long answer to your short question, but sometimes really easy ones can take 4 to 6 months. Often a more complicated one can take over a year, and the really complex ones we've had ongoing for a few years.
Committee, thank you, sir. I think we'll move on to other public testimony now. Come on up, Jim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jim McGagin with Wyoming Stockgrowers Association, today also representing the Wyoming Wool Growers Association. We're very supportive of this bill for a couple of reasons. Probably the most critical part to us is the language that's being inserted on page 2, beginning on line 9 with notice. That is so critical. And I'll perhaps give you an example right now of a scenario that we're dealing with where the state has proposed to the Forest Service a land exchange in southern Carbon County. I've taken no position on the exchange itself, but specific parcels of state trust land have been identified in that proposal that is now public. And the current lessees of those proposals were never given any advance notice of that or any opportunity to provide input on it. So we think this is necessary, and I would suggest for your consideration, perhaps amending this slightly on line 11, striking including notice to leaseholders of the state lands to be exchanged, completing those others, and then adding at the bottom, including direct notice to leaseholders of those lands to be exchanged. I may look at the Office of State Lands website frequently, I do, but the average state lessee out there is not looking at that website. They don't necessarily even have access to a local newspaper that's going to have that information in a meaningful way, and we believe that they should be directly informed at the appropriate time in the process. The one I've referenced is a more public process because it involves a federal agency, so it can be done very early in the process. In some other cases, if it's involves private negotiation, it may be a little later, but it needs to be not just we put out public notice, but we've advised these lessees that these lands are being considered for exchange, and they be given an opportunity to provide comment on them. With regards to the remainder of the bill, we think these are good criteria. The criteria currently existing in statute for looking at possible exchanges are geared toward, as they should be, what is the best interest of the beneficiaries of the land trust and of the management of the state trust lands. That needs to be the prime consideration. But in addition to that, I think it's very appropriate to consider the factors that are contained in this bill that are more focused on the external impacts of an exchange than necessarily just the impacts on the management and revenues to be derived from state trust lands. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I would be happy to take any questions.
Committee questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Further public testimony? Come on up, Mr. Moline.
Brett Moline, Wyoming Farm Bureau Federation, sitting in support of this bill. I appreciate the comments from Mr. McGagnon and certainly support those. There is one change that my organization would like to see, and that's under BI, where the exchange, if the state lands are wholly within one county, my organization would appreciate if the entire exchange is within one county. We see what's happened with some exchanges. There was one in Albany County several years ago. They blocked up a lot of private land, but the Albany County lost out on the private land. Laramie County gained in private lands. We'd like to have a priority where the entire exchange is within a county rather than just the state lands that's the way I read that one, that the state lands are within a county. So I would suggest that change. With that, Mr. Chairman, I would sit for any questions.
Committee? Okay. I had read that it did that. So I'm go ahead through it again.
Well, Mr. Chairman, committee, the way I read that, if the state lands are wholly within the same county, that's the way I read that little I. Exchange where the resulting state lands, if the exchange is completed, are wholly within the same county. I see that as emphasizing the state lands. The private lands could be, you could have an exchange to get state lands in Carbon County, and then the private lands could be in Crook County. So my organization would appreciate that the priority is if all the lands considered for the exchange are within one county. That would stop one county from having a loss of private lands.
So we would I'm understanding you, we would eliminate. Okay.
Okay.
That's, makes more
Mr.
sense.
Chairman, not eliminate that
Right.
line, but to have, instead of the state lands being within one county, all the lands considered for exchange would be within one county.
Yep. We'll try to word craft that to make it more clear.
Thank you. Other than that, good bill. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All righty. Any other public testimony? Come on up, Mrs. Herman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Committee. Marguerite Herman, I'm here testifying for the Advocates for School Trust Lands. It's a group representing the advocates for good management of school trust lands in mostly Western states, the only states that really have any measurable land left after their acts of admission. And I come because this, I think, this bill is, well, I guess, first of all, I was going to mention just a bit of history that when we became a state in 1890, the state took possession of these lands with the understanding from a grantor to grantee that we would manage these for the beneficiaries, which has been stated, which is the common school, public schools. And that is a fiduciary duty that is not negotiable. That is the first priority in all cases. And I caution against legislation that somehow weakens the legislature's performance of that fiduciary trustee duty. And I think what Mr. Crowder mentioned is that what they have developed is a system of weighing these exchanges, keeping the revenue to the common schools as required by trust law everywhere, as first and foremost. And with the other considerations that they have in rural, and I've watched this over the years, and they do a very good job of taking into consideration these other factors, that it does not impact the income to the trust. So the other considerations are definitely secondary and tertiary. They're not primary, and they can be considered to the extent they do not impact the income to the trust. And which includes, as I think, it also is the future ability, whatever is in statute, the future ability of OSLI and the Board of Land Commissioners to negotiate and to strike a best deal. So anything that I think degrades the negotiating position does have an impact on the trust. And I caution against anything that goes beyond what they've already managed to do through rule, which I think does meet the fiduciary duty, does take other things in consideration. Injecting the one county. I guess you can pile on all the secondary considerations, and eventually it does have an effect on the income to the trust. And which, let me just say, I've been watching the legislature since 1980, and no one used to care because there was plenty of revenue for schools. And now I think we're more cognizant of money that goes to the corpus of the Common School Land Fund, but also to the income fund. And that the extent to which money to that is, aside from the fiduciary duty, it has to be made up from somewhere. So anything that I think harms the income and the ability of our state to get the most benefit out of these trust lands, and they are trust lands. I will, any people say they're state lands, which sometimes that leads the belief that they're public, and they are not public in any way, shape, or form. So I would just urge you to rely on what the OSLI has in place. It has worked well. The noticing features, I think, don't impair the ability to make money. And I would also suggest that this and other bills being considered by the legislature, that maybe some analysis be done. And if there is an impact to the trust in revenue, is that the legislature finds some other way to make it whole, compensate the trust for the lost income. If you're managing it in a fashion that does impact the income, is to make it whole from some other source. I think that would be that would be the responsibility of the trustee, you as the trustee. And just sort of, the comments from Mr. Crowder, I'll sort of incorporate those by reference into my comments. And so that's the extent of my comments. I guess what I'm arguing is against that we don't need the bill, that actually the rules are in place that really do consider everything possible while preserving the fiduciary duty. If you do go forward with this and other bills that have a perceptible, excuse me, impact on income and ability and negotiating ability, that you make compensate the trust as well. That would be the balancing act there. So thank you. And any questions?
Questions, committee? Okay. Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Obermuller.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Pete Obermuller with the Petroleum Association of Wyoming. Happy to be here this morning. I appreciate it. Very much appreciate the comments of Ms. Herman. She's precisely correct about the fiduciary responsibility of the Office of State Lands and Investments as it relates to state lands. So, Mr. Chairman, the Petroleum Association is opposed to the bill, and it could, if the committee is interested in moving it, it could be changed in a way that I suppose is okay, and I'll offer a couple of suggestions here. But essentially, our arguments are similar to Ms. Herman's in the sense that state lands exist for the purpose of accruing revenue for schools. That's why they're created. That's why they're there. And so the ability for Office of State Lands to evaluate and manage them and be able to trade and exchange them for the benefit of schools is of primary importance, and everything else is secondary beyond that. So, Mr. Chairman, with respect to the bill itself, on the notification requirements on page 2, I think we think that is fine. It's allowing for public comment and notice is totally fine. With respect to timing, Mr. Chairman, I would suggest the following amendment on line 9, that line 9 after lands is a period, strike the word after, have that sentence begin, the director, insert shall, and delete the S on provides. That would, what that does, of course, is just require that the notice happens, but allows the Office of State Lands to do it in the timing that makes sense, as you heard from other testimony about when notice is appropriate. That in some cases we don't, because the state getting involved in exchanges and of state lands can artificially inflate or deflate the value of the land in question, that the Office of State Lands needs the flexibility to be able to hold that back in certain cases for a period of time, not forever, but for a period of time. So require the notice is fine, but allow that timing. Moving on to their criteria, Mr. Chairman. Similar to Mr. Crowder, we're confused by this, but mostly we find it to be unnecessarily limiting. A couple of them in particular. B, Romanet I, where the state lands or all the lands, as Mr. Moline suggested, are wholly within the same county. That's a severely limiting restriction. State lands, the limiting OSLI to only look within the confines of one county severely limits the ability of the office to look at what makes sense across the state in terms of consolidating state lands, the ability to manage state lands to meet community needs. You may not be able to meet a community need just in Platte County. You have to look in Platte and Goshen, and then it starts to make sense. Don't make the problem so small that the OSLI doesn't have the options to look for solutions that are beyond those counties. B1, I think, is severely limiting and should be removed. B2, I appreciate what Mr. Crowder said about looking toward how we can allow for access to state lands. That's a fine exercise, particularly in our state where we all want and appreciate access to lands as much as we possibly can. But as Ms. Herman pointed out, access to state lands is actually not a criteria for state lands because state lands are not public lands in the way that we all are used to public lands on the federal side. The other two are fine. It's just that they already happen. So I'm unsure that those are necessary. So, Mr. Chairman, the bottom line is all of the language really on page 3 and 4 we don't think is necessary. I offered you a suggestion on page 2, and the last suggestion I would make is on page 3 or on page 4, line 8, section 2, that we ought not try to change the rules or increase the confusion around the process midstream on any pending transactions or trades. The act should only apply to land exchanges after the effective date of this act, not ones that are currently in process. Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to take questions.
Committee questions? Thank you. Other public testimony?
Oh, there we go. Okay, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'll briefly speak on behalf of the Pilot Hill project. I
Could
believe,
you give us your name and
I'm sorry, Keith Riddle.
Keith what?
Riddle, R-I-T-T-L-E. That project, I believe, was referenced today, and I just wanted to note as a board member of that project that followed it throughout its consideration and being put into effect, being in both Albany and Laramie County, that by all counts, it was a tremendous success. It increased revenues to the state fund in that the recreation lease entered for the lands that were part of the swap are considerably higher on a per acre basis than the agricultural lease that was attached prior to the exchange. The private landowners involved, to my understanding, all strongly supported it. It served their goals, and it resulted in a wildlife habitat management area being established, which is good for wildlife and provides for additional hunting access in the area. So I would second the comments today that it is in the interest of the citizens of the state and the mission of the state lands program to maximize revenue and to retain some flexibility, that the county limitation is an arbitrary one, especially when you have lands joining county lines involved, and that leaving some flexibility to a program that has really resulted in some good projects that flexibility should remain in place. So thank you, and I'll take any questions if there are any.
Questions, committee? Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Further public testimony? Okay, we'll close to public testimony. Committee, what's your pleasure? Move the bill. Moved by Davis. Second? Seconded by Banks. Discussion on the bill. Go ahead, Representative Davis.
Mr. Chairman, I believe that those are on page 2, line 9, where we insert the period and take out after, and then that gives good direction for the director that the director shall provide the notice. I think that would be a good insert in there.
Okay, that's a motion. A motion, Representative Davis?
Yes.
Do we have a second on that motion to amend it? Okay. You have that, Mark?
I do. We're striking after, and we're inserting, after director, we're inserting shall, but then you'll need to take off the S on provides. Is
Yeah,
that correct?
correct, in a period after lands. Okay, committee discussion on that amendment. All those in favor say, oops, more discussion. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make clear what we're doing here. I'm not speaking for or against the amendment necessarily, but I think part of the problem is some of these exchanges have happened within our counties and in our communities that oftentimes the people who are involved around, and this I can tell you because this has happened at home in our county, oftentimes many of the people around the exchange didn't know the exchange was happening until it was too late. And I think that was the attempt by that language, was to make sure that everybody, including surrounding landowners, knew what was going on. I assume that was the intent during the interim. I wasn't here, but I just wanted to point that out, that I think that's what the word after is trying to get at. I'm not sure it does, but I think we're still okay with the amendment, but just making that clear. It's something we might want to all think about.
Representative Banks.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I think the way it's written kind of gives it a more clear, we're not going to go forward with the exchange until after the notice is provided. And if we've learned something, I think we've learned that if we want to have it, it needs to be written in statute, or else it's going to be loopholed around. So I would argue to keep the writing in there that it's as it's written.
Okay, further discussion. Representative Schlegel.
One question I have for the committee. It was mentioned earlier that we should include direct notice to the leaseholders of that land. I wonder if we want to go ahead and put that in there.
Would the mover of the amendment consider that a friendly amendment to the amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, that would be fine.
Okay.
You could even take it, if you wanted to take it a little bit further and put certified mail or something like that, you know.
Okay.
I don't know what your definition of direct would be.
Yeah, I'm not sure what it is either. Representative Banks.
I would argue that we do that as a separate amendment, and because I'm okay with including the direct notice. I think that's a great addition. Still not so convinced that we need to strike the after and shall, so I don't know what the committee's preference is, but maybe do this after and shall one first, and then include the direct notice piece after we discuss the first one.
Okay, I don't think it's been seconded, so we can do it that way. We'll just deal with the first motion. Any further discussion on the motion? Okay, sensing you're ready to vote, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
That amendment fails. So we leave the language alone. There another amendment? Anyone want to address the word direct? Go ahead, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would move that on line 11, after the word including and before the word notice, we insert the word direct.
Second, moved and seconded. Any further discussion on that? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, that amendment passes. And so,
Chairman,
yes,
the second on that was who?
I'll amend.
Thank you.
So I guess further discussion, Representative Craigo brought up the idea that these have been done without any notice to the landowners. His county, I know Campbell County's another hot spot of contention over why we need this bill, and we had a bill, and I don't know where, but it didn't make it through the whole process. I can't remember if it was this last year or the year before, but it was brought to try to address that problem. And so the next part of this, we have a lot of conflicting ideas as to whether it's needed or whether the process works on its own. I would say the people who brought the bill a couple years ago would say it doesn't work on its own. And I'm not arguing for or against the bill. Is there more discussion on what we do with the rest of the bill?
Mr. Chairman,
Okay, let me get down to are you ready, Mr. Conrad?
Yes, sir.
Representative Conrad.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the areas I don't think we've addressed yet on page 4, section 2, is it related to whether this was immediately after and/or to not include pending cases. That issue, in my mind, has not been resolved, and just as a brief question to you and the committee, where did we end up as it related to adjacent versus, I guess, counties or lands outside of the respective adjoining counties? If I worded that correctly. Should I repeat that?
Yeah, repeat it.
Let's talk specifically at point number 1 on page 4. Section 2, we did speak specifically or did hear testimony as it related to line 10. I never did hear a clarification on after the effective date of this act. Were we going to include some language that this would not impact pending cases?
Mr. Chairman, I think it's a simple removing of pending. Was that what the discussion was on
I
that?
believe it was.
Okay. Is there a motion
I'll make that motion, Mr. Chairman.
I'll second it.
that would remove pending from, in line, page
9.
4, line 9, remove pending? Okay. Further discussion, Representative Banks?
You know, I understand where that's coming from, but I'm hearing from a lot of constituents that the problems are imminent and necessary and would like to be dealt with now. So I think if this helps fix some of the problems they're dealing with when it comes to regards on this, if the pending ones are affected, you could argue that that's gonna help some of our people with these problems. And so all of the ones that are now currently trying to be processed and involved, are they still gonna get pushed back into this old way that we're trying to fix? I guess would be my question.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah, Representative Davis?
could the director tell us how many possible exchanges are in the process out there right now? How many acts are we looking at?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Davis, without going into detail of the whole process for land transactions, there's many categories that transactions fit in, and we've been a little bit slow in moving any of them just due to lack of staffing. So a lot of them are in the very early stages, waiting for somebody to be able to get in and dig into them. But I believe roughly off the top of my head, we have anywhere from 6 to 8 sitting in a position where they could move forward.
Thank you.
Okay. Representative Schlegel?
Deputy Director Crowder, sorry to question you as you laughed, but my question would be, if you've got these in place already and we didn't remove this pending, does that make the whole process more complicated, or what would be the result of that, would be my question.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Slagle, it depends on what stage of the process each transaction is in. From my viewpoint, removing the word pending doesn't really change the impact to the transactions that are currently going on. They're still in play, they're still in a process moving forward. Some of those transactions have or are coming close to their notification period, where we have gotten close to writing a detailed analysis and may be ready to publish that. Some of them are many months, in fact, maybe years away. The transaction that was represented with the Forest Service, we're not even close to our notification part of that. The Forest Service is, and obviously that's been going out, but the state process isn't there yet. So it probably wouldn't impact that transaction or any of them like that.
Thank you.
Okay, further discussion. Okay, so we did have a motion on removing the word pending. Did you have further discussion? Go ahead, Representative Craigo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually agree with the idea of the motion. I just don't think removing the word pending, I agree with the deputy director, doesn't get us to where we need to go. I mean, I have a suggestion, but I don't, just taking that word out doesn't, the language still isn't clear of whether or not it applies to pending or not. But I think we can do that, and I agree with the idea.
Mr. Chairman,
Representative Conrad.
respect to Representative Craigo, I withdraw that motion and await further definition with
Okay.
regards to the pending.
So the motion's been withdrawn, and we'll have further discussion on how to fix this. Go ahead, Representative Craigo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So same page 4, line 9. And we would strike beginning with pending through the end of that line. And going down to line 10, we would strike the word state land exchanges. And so then it would just, and then on line 9, we would insert the words initiated or considered. And it'll say this act shall apply to all state land exchanges initiated or considered after the effective date of this act. And the reason I'm, Mr.
So-
Chairman, well, I'll move the amendment and then we'll
Yeah.
for discussion.
It's been moved. Do we have a second? Second. Okay, it's been moved by Craigo, seconded by Conrad to, on line 9, after exchanges, strike from pending on the effective date of this act and all state land exchanges. That would be the portion that we'd strike, and insert initiated or considered. So it would read, land exchanges initiated or considered after the effective date of this act. Any discussion on that? Representative Craigo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just worried that if we apply it to pending exchanges, that depending on where we are within the processes, how that's going to apply to notice, and they've already most of these exchanges, they've already decided why they're doing them or why they're going down that road, and now we're going to change the rules on them in the middle of that process. I'm a little bit concerned about that. At least this way, we'll have a set date on which the new rules will go into effect, and it won't create some weird appeal process for those that are already in the process of doing the state land exchange. So I think it's just a cleaner way to do that. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, any, sensing you're ready to vote, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No. Okay, that amendment passes. Further discussion on the bill?
Mr. Chairman, who seconded that amendment?
Conrad did? Okay. Any other, yes, Representative Winter.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm wondering if we resolve the question raised by Mr. Moline and Mr. Obermuller relative to the question concerning whether all the lands would be considered or not in each county. Do we need to discuss that a little more?
That's what we're doing, so go ahead and discuss. what changing that does at least? So presently, you could have exchanges involving state lands that are wholly in one county, but involve other lands from other counties, correct? And do we want to change that to where all of the land considered in the exchanges within one county or not? Representative Schlegel.
One comment in regard to this. I think we were talking about, the discussion was brought up, the amount of value that can be brought in from different activities. That's why they're looking at doing this. And one of the issues that we haven't talked about is how ag values have not been held on par with other things in our country. So as we look at ag land right now, it is not on par with some of the other industries that we're looking at. And so this makes it a tough issue to discuss. I mean, it's just something for your consideration. I don't have any solutions for this. And the other issue is, I understand the idea of wanting to keep exchanges wholly within one county, because if we move them out of one county, if we put all the state lands, and granted with the way the money is being divided for schools now, it's not as big a deal. But it used to be income from one county went to the schools in that county. And if we consolidate it all in another county, then we've switched the income from one county to the other. I mean, that's just something for our consideration. Thank you.
Further discussion? Representative Craigo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I agree with the comments of Representative Slagle. So I think we need to do one of two things, in my opinion. We either need to fix it and fix the language where the entire exchange happens within one county, or we just need to remove that provision as one of the considering factors, so that, because as it's written now, it doesn't achieve that goal of protecting the tax base in one particular county versus another, because as the good representative said, you could consolidate all the state lands in one county and push all the private deeded land that is subject to taxation into 3 or 4 or 22 other counties. And I don't think that's what we're trying to do. So I think we need to do one or the other, and I really don't have a preference.
Okay, any further, I guess, yeah, Representative Banks.
I just have a question, maybe for you, Mr. Chairman, or anybody involved in the interim who worked on this. The purpose that we wanted to include them in the same county. Was there a purpose behind that that we need to be reminded of? Or I'm just wondering what the purpose was that we have that in there, if anybody remembers.
I don't. I'm not real sure. The county lines are pretty arbitrary. They were, and where the state lands and lands to be considered, I'm not convinced we need this in the bill. So I would move to strike Romanet I and then shift everything as necessary with the other Romanets. Do we have a second on that motion?
I'll second it.
Seconded by Alleman. Any discussion on that idea to remove Romanet I? Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
That motion passes. Further discussion on the bill?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
just for clarification, when a land exchange occurs, are there multiple state sections or private sections that are thrown out there for an exchange to occur? Or is it just 1-to-1, I guess is my question, for the value, are there multiple, say, state sections for a private section, or are they just, i.e., 1-for-1 in each county?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Davis, it depends on the transaction. We've had transactions that were 10 acres for 10 acres within the same county, and we've also had transactions that were 12,000 acres split between two counties. So it really depends on how much or the transaction that's being presented to us. There are times when we are working proactively, like we are with the federal government in the exchange in the Medicine Bow National Forest, where we're just trying to prove a concept, essentially at this point. Can we benefit one, another agency within the office for their, or within the state for their mission? But two, can we increase manageability and revenue generating potential on the lands that are within the boundaries of that forest? And it's a concept. We don't understand all of the values or all the attributes that are going into this transaction. We haven't written the detailed analysis, and the Forest Service hasn't finished their NEPA work. So to help prove out the concept, we've added more lands into the transaction that could, than what will ultimately be included in the transaction, just so that we have some meat in the middle place. And that is somewhat driven by land values. It's also driven by the attributes and the missions of both entities, the Forest Service versus the state. But oftentimes, these transactions are brought to us by private individuals knowing exactly the lands that they want to exchange for. So they're very specific and very definite, and we don't change outside of that unless the values come back through the appraisal process, indicating we need to make a shift to make a value for value situation occur.
Thank you. Further discussion. I guess a question I would ask of Representative Davis, how does the passage or the failure of this bill affect your project on West Fork? Because I think that's what committee, I think we're talking about that. And there's a land exchange and a NEPA process underway, correct? And I haven't been a part of that NEPA process, but I'm curious how this bill will affect that.
Well, Mr. Chairman, the NEPA process is addressing the proposed action. The land exchange is a secondary process that is working at the same time. And as the director pointed out, there's multiple state sections offered up looking for the choices for the best dollar for dollar or value for value exchange. Now, how that shakes out will be in the process through the Forest Service and the State Lands Board. So it's kind of you're given these many options out there. It's up to the process to choose which ones would make the process whole. And maybe one, maybe all of them. I don't know. That'll work out in the process.
What I understood from you is that that process is happening and can happen without this bill, though. Okay. Any further discussion on the bill? Okay, sensing we're ready to vote. Question's been called. No, I don't think we're on an amendment. We're done with amendments. We're ready to vote, Mark.
Voting on House Bill 20. Representative Allemand,
Aye.
Representative Allred,
Aye.
Representative Banks,
Aye.
Representative Conrad,
No.
Representative Crago,
Aye.
Representative Davis,
Aye.
Representative Slagle,
Aye.
Representative Winter,
Aye.
Chairman Eklund,
No.
so we have 8 aye, 2 no.
All right, that bill passes. I sense we have some problems with it, so there may be some language coming to the floor before we're done with it. So, thank you, committee, and we're going to move on to our next bill. But before I do that, I'd like to take the liberty of complimenting everybody on how well we've worked through these, chewed through these bills and worked them. 22 was an especially good job of looking at things critically and getting things done to the best of our ability, and the committee did a good job. Next bill for our consideration is It's all, and the reason I add that is that we're in such a rush at the end, I don't have time to tell you say that, so I'll say it now. Next bill for our consideration is 106. Would you like to? It almost makes a round table that way, so. This bill was brought to us by Representative Schlegel and is due to the way some things are affected in his part of the country.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Alan Slagle, representative for House District 2. I bring this bill 106, eminent domain wind energy collector systems. And basically, it's just, it's dealing with, we've got a lot of wind energy people approaching the state right now up in House District 2. And my constituents have brought the concerns to me because it's only being, well, the company doing this project has only applied to the state lands for putting their wind chargers on state lands. And that's how our private citizens have been notified of it. They got a consent form from the state asking them to consent to having a co-lease on that land. And so the concern is they really haven't talked to private landowners about leasing land. It's just been to the state at this point. And so what we've done, this is actually in the statute currently, and we've just, the date had expired in June of 2015, and we've just moved the date out to June of 2032. And what this is for is to limit the ability of wind producers to come in and use eminent domain to put power lines across the private landowners next adjoining the state land. And that's basically what the bill is. I would stand for any questions.
Questions, committee. Representative Conrad.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Conrad.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Slagle, thank you. How was the value of 2032 derived? I mean, was that a algorithm that was based on some sort of mathematical formula?
The date, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, we went from 2015 to 2032. Why?
Okay. Well, no, when I was doing this, it was still 2022. And I was thinking, the talk was it'd be about 10 years for the project to be completed. So I was thinking 10 years. So I did that, I put it in, and then we got down here, it's 2023. So really, it should have been 2033. But I think 9 or 10 years, it's not gonna make too much difference. It's just, that's where I had come up with that arbitrary date.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Mr. Slagle, Representative Slagle.
Other questions? Thank you. Why don't you just stay there, if you
Okay.
would? You'll get to vote like usual, but I
Okay.
think we'll have other public testimony, and you may be addressing some of it as we go.
Okay.
Commissioner Wade, welcome to the committee meeting.
Thank you. I'm Pat Wade. I'm chairman of the Niobrara County Commissioners, and here to testify on this. I am very much in favor of this bill. And to kind of pile on to what Representative Slagle said, this came on our radar here within about the last year. And there's a company that is considering a major wind project in Niobrara and Commerce counties. I've got a letter that I provided for you all to look at that was sent to one of our people. that holds a state lease. And it says that they are looking to develop in excess of 100,000 acres in Niobrara and Converse counties, over 100,000 acres on state lands. So that's important to note. I'd asked that you would look at that letter when you have a chance. As a side note, I'd ask that you look at it really closely and see how it was written, and it gives you an idea how the people in my county are being approached on this. So I'm here to talk and give things from several different perspectives. First, as a county commissioner, also as a landowner that received one of those state lessee letters. And also as someone that helped organize and was a lead negotiator on some major pipeline easements. Through my work there, I've had fairly extensive experience on that. So currently, a wind farm, this is important for us all to think about. Currently, a wind farm has no ability to condemn where the farm is. Those people that choose to develop their land have that full right. And it's important to know on these projects that everyone from the investors to the contractors to the landowners, and in this case, state lands, everyone has the ability to say no until we start talking about these feeder lines that connect these projects together. Now, in my case, when I look at the footprint that's proposed on this, in Niobrara County, if you can picture North Highway 20, Highway 20 is the highway that runs east and west through Lusk. Roughly from Highway 20, almost 35 miles north, clear from the Nebraska-South Dakota border to the Converse County border. That takes up a chunk of my county. Now, there is one larger block, but the most part of this is section 16 and 36 within a township. So you start picturing what this is going to look like to start tying this thing together. And so that really puts it on my radar. And like I said, it's important to note everyone can say no until we talk about those connector and feeder lines. I completely support people's property rights to develop a wind farm. I want to make that plain. But as soon as a project is put together, whether it's a group of landowners, state land, whatever, they immediately put their neighbors in a situation to potentially have a power line that they may not want. Also, in this, I mentioned about my time negotiating for pipeline easements. Now, in my work on that, I have literally helped negotiate hundreds of miles of pipeline easements, stretching from the Bakken Field in North Dakota to Cushing, Oklahoma, that size of projects. And was taken to school by what I think is probably the leading property rights law firm in the West that's based right here in Cheyenne. So I've had quite a little education. Now, the one thing, and there will be some things that are completely aligned, whether it's a pipeline easement or a power line easement. The big thing that comes to mind is liability. Now, that was a hard pill for me to swallow when I first started looking at these easements. Of course, pipelines had the ability to condemn. It was hard for me to understand that I should have any liability on a project that I ultimately could not say no to, but it's not that way. And as a landowner, you immediately take on liability. And in this case, with power lines, the thing that comes to my mind is if you have a hunter, whether he's invited or not, he shoots a power line down, it drops down, starts a fire, burns out the neighbors. If it happened off my place, I may have just sold the ranch, So that was one thing we worked extremely hard on, is ways to limit liability. I completely understand those that are being asked to have a power line could do the same thing we did. The problem is, in this case, in Niobrara County, in many cases, is it takes numbers to make those groups effective, those landowner groups effective. And there are, quite frankly, there's people that are not comfortable with that. They want to negotiate their own agreement. I understand that. A lot of these lines in Niobrara County be so short that it won't involve a lot of people. They will have no leverage or very little. So that makes it very difficult for a landowner group, in my mind, to operate with the same efficiency. One thing that I would suggest as you consider this is to also add solar projects to this. So with that, I'd be happy to stand for questions.
Committee questions? Something I would add to the pipeline liability is the neighbor next door to the pipeline could be liable as well. We discovered that in testimony. Well, the case you're talking about was being talked about because it's already happened. Pipeline ruptures in your neighbor's place and the oil flows onto your place, and suddenly you're the one they bill to clean up the spill. So anyway, it gets pretty complex, but any questions?
Mr. Chair,
Yeah, Representative Davis.
maybe I'm misreading this letter, but maybe the director of the Office of State Lands could tell us, when did the state get involved in the installation of wind turbines, number one? And the state plans for these things? Are we partnering up with these private entities?
Director Crowder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Representative Davis. Jason Crowder, Deputy Director for the Office of State Lands and Investments. We have not gotten in the business of erecting wind turbines. We do require all applicants to provide a consent and notification form to existing lessees on the property that they're looking at developing. And this project, we had the same expectation. And it appears as though they are doing that work, trying to educate the lessees of their project and receive any consent that they can, and understand any liabilities or liabilities is a wrong term to use here, but any impacts, negative impacts to that existing leasehold that they can, and try to mitigate those. The way they did that is not how we would like them to. We did not write that letter for them. We didn't approve that letter for them, and we didn't give any indication that the state is supporting their project. We're simply providing land for an opportunity for them to develop upon. Commissioner Wade has provided that letter to us as well. He did that a couple days ago, and we're in the process of contacting that company and making them aware that the state is not promoting their project, simply providing land for an opportunity to develop upon.
Thank you.
Representative Allemand.
I have a question for Mr. Wade and then a follow-up with Mr. Crowder. Mr. Wade, are these turbines being put only on state land?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Balaman, this is how they have started their approach in the county. Up to this point, I know of some landowners that have showed some interest in developing their property I think after they became aware that the state lands was approached, but I do not know of any, I'm not aware of any landowners that were initially approached to see if they were interested in it. And if I could, Mr. Chairman, I didn't provide the letter to throw state lands under the bus at all. But I do appreciate the representative's statement. That's what I wanted you all to see, is how this project is being approached and how that is such a concern to the people there.
Okay. Representative Alderman?
My follow-up to Mr. Crowder, is state getting in direct straight direct Alzheimer's. Is the state getting in direct competition with our private industry? Is the state receiving the same royalties and damages that our private citizens are receiving? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Alderman, that's a great question. So when we initially were approached with this project, we understood it to only be on state lands. And so we did begin our analysis of it. We began looking at all of the lands involved to understand all the existing uses. If we actually owned them, were they conducive to wind development? It wasn't until later that we understood that really state lands only makes up 40% of the proposed project. And again, the proposed project could grow and shrink depending on landowner negotiations, access, transmission lines, and anything else that might be in front of this project getting ultimate approval. So when we understood that we weren't the majority or the whole project, we always indicate in those situations to our applicants that we need to let the private process work. We need to have those private agreements negotiated, because that's the best terms that can be had, is when the people who are closest to the ground are doing the negotiating first. And the last thing we want to do is have an applicant be able to use the state as leverage. We do have a template lease that we can provide to them, and we have, and it's got some very specific terms in it, but it also has terms that are negotiated on a project by project basis. And we don't want the applicants to utilize our negotiated terms to tell an adjoining landowner, look, the state agreed to this, you should too. We want to have that agreement agreed to at the private level, and then it come back to the state. Then we are assured that we are getting what the private landowners are getting, and hopefully that's the best agreement that can be had. Another part of that, it's the last paragraph in all of our leases, is what we call a favored nations clause, and it basically states any terms that are more beneficial within the project in another landowner sense must be applied to the state as well. So anytime they may negotiate a better rate, we get the benefit of that at the same time.
Follow up.
As I read the second paragraph in the letter that was supplied to us, it reads to me that the surveyors and the wind company, they're not asking for the rancher's permission to even cross them. They're asking them what the gate codes are. They're asking them, there's nothing in there like, let's sit down and talk and let's come up with an agreement on our trespass fee. Is that right or wrong?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Alaman, this was not the first communication that lessees had received. I think, I know myself and my wife got a separate one early on as holders of a state lease, just announcing their interest, asking what the landowners, if the land or the lessees were agreeable to the project, so on. So I don't think what you have in front of you is the first thing that those people had seen. I think it was the way the company was approaching them more towards when they were looking to come and look at the property, do their initial surveys of the property. But it does tell quite a little of how it is being approached, in my estimation.
Representative Banks?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just adding on to that, I just would like to know, so there's current grazing leases that are on this, state piece. If the people who right now have those grazing leases don't agree with the project, do they proceed anyway? Whoever wants to take that one.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Banks, that's the intent of the notification and consent form, is for that lessee to indicate if he wants it or not, and for them to also indicate if there are substantial impacts to their existing leasehold, and what those might be. We allow the applicant to try to mitigate those with that existing lessee. If they can't, then our rules indicate that we have 20 days to see if we can't find a place where we can mitigate that existing leasehold interest and whatever negative impact there is. If we can't, then the Board of Land Commissioners has the authority to not approve the lease on that property. But at the same time, they also have the ability to approve that, regardless of the desire of that existing lessee. And they're doing that from a fiduciary standpoint, obviously, trying to make sure that the impacts that are represented by that lessee are legitimate impacts and not just saying, I don't want wind, period, that's it. But more, let me understand what are the impacts, and when I understand those impacts, do they raise to a level to actually stop the project or not?
Representative Conrad?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Slagle, if in fact this were successful in bringing it out to 2032, would this eliminate these issues until that point? Or will we be revisiting the same issue in 2030?
Well, I think it would help to eliminate these issues because it would make it where these wind companies couldn't use eminent domain to build their distribution lines across private property. Is that clear?
Mr. Chairman, thanks. Representative Slagle, yes, and a follow-up question if I may, Mr. Chairman. Educate me, when we talk about state lands, which is specifically what this is referring to, and I respect obviously the leases that are held here, ultimately, is that decision placed at, as mentioned earlier, State Lands Commission on the best use of that land?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Conrad, I believe it's like Deputy Director Crowder said. They've sent out this consent form to current lessees, and so they have that option of saying this new deal is not compatible with grazing if they want. But like he also said, ultimately the State Lands Board has the authority to make the decision on whether to go ahead and lease that or not.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Slagle, thank you.
Okay. All right, a question I've got. So we're talking about transmission lines, and if we can't put a stop without this legislation on those lines that would go all the way across your county. Has there been discussion of how this affects individual landowners that may want the wind collectors on their place? Because it increases the income on private property substantially. It wouldn't just be the state property. Has that discussion taken place with your people? We've done this before. We put a moratorium on collector lines. And we did it because there were, as I recall, it was a long time ago, as I recall, there were only certain landowners where the collector lines were going in that would receive significant payment for the lines. That's what the main part I remember from that bill. But have you had this conversation with, in a widespread fashion, with the other people affected along or near this, the private land along or near this collector line?
Mr. Chairman, somewhat. I brought it up with especially one landowner that I know is very interested, and asked how we balance this. in Niobrara County, we're looking at planning and zoning right now. We're updating our planning and zoning plan because we have nothing to address wind or solar. So this is something that I've spent some time on here lately. And I have talked quite a little with one of the landowners that is interested in. And the thing that I'm struggling with in this is how we balance these property rights to ensure that a landowner has the ability to develop their land if they so choose. But it becomes really difficult, and we need to remember that that landowner can always say no. They're not forced into the transaction. As soon as a power line route is established, that person comes into a position where they, in the end, they cannot say no. And it puts you in a way different situation in terms of negotiation. What this bill would do, in my mind, is it would make those affected landowners that have a power line, it would also make them willing participants in the project, the same as what they have to do, we're required to do for the wind farm itself.
Okay. If the power lines were put in place, the landowners would no longer have the ability to keep the wind chargers off their property then? Or did I misunderstand you?
Well, maybe I'm not being clear. My concern is that those that have the wind farm, they're not forced into the project. They can say no. Those people, when they're on a power line route, in the end, as it currently is, they don't have the ability to say no. They're forced into a situation, which all the other participating, the people that are participating are willing. If this bill would pass, to me, it causes a wind generation company to also make willing partners out of whoever has to have a power line, wherever that route is needed. In other words, they would be forced to come to terms rather than being able to condemn it.
Oh, okay. All right. I was thinking about it wrong. Did everybody understand that?
Mr. Chairman, if I'm hearing this correctly, we're not, if they were to develop on the 40%, what we're concerned with is the utility corridor to get off the project to the line that goes to wherever. That's what the big issue is here,
Yes, Mr. Chairman, that is exactly right. And as I said earlier on, when you picture section 16 and 36 and start trying to tie all those projects together, I'm sure that there will be an effort to make bigger blocks, obviously, but the power lines still have to get out to an end source, to wherever they need to go. So that is exactly right, though.
All right. Okay, we'll have further public testimony. I'm going to well, why don't you come up in the back? And then we'll have you, Mr. Magagna.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Macrina Sharp, and I'm an attorney with Holland and Hart here in Cheyenne. I'm here today on behalf of the American Clean Power Association, an association that represents developers and operators of wind, solar, and storage projects across Wyoming. We're here to impress upon the committee how detrimental House Bill 106 is to the state of Wyoming. The ability to exercise eminent domain is an incredibly important tool. And it's a tool of last resort, but it needs to be available for developers across the board in Wyoming. A policy that eliminates that type of tool is a policy that is detrimental to Wyoming. And it does impede an economic development in the state. It holds Wyoming back as a leader in the power industry, and it prevents diversification in our state. At the end of the day, this policy is also unnecessary because there are already significant protections built into the system for landowners. And to that end, I'm here today with Isaac Setvin, who is an expert in condemnation and a partner at Holland and Hart, who specializes in this area of law. And so I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Setvin, who can hopefully explain to the committee why it is that this bill is unnecessary and why it is that there already is a structure in Wyoming that's working today.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, representatives. I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you. I'm proud to have been a Wyoming lawyer for 20 years, and for about 15 of those years, I have been specializing in acquiring surface use rights and property rights for all sorts of projects. And that has included a significant number of cases involving the Wyoming Eminent Domain Act. What I think is important to note, and I also just wanted to say, like that process, I've been involved in all sorts of different aspects of acquiring those rights, whether it's pipelines, roads, oil and gas development pads, power lines, really across the spectrum. Most of the time, I will say that I have represented energy and companies that have needed to acquire those rights to develop public projects. But I've also had occasion to represent the landowners in defending against what I have viewed were improper uses of the Wyoming Eminent Domain Act. And so I feel like I've been able to develop a tremendous perspective on both sides of the issue. As Ms. Sharp pointed out, eminent domain, the Eminent Domain Act is a very balanced and fair tool. I heard from Representative Slagle and from Commissioner Ward, one of the concerns is balancing various and competing land rights. And also, frankly, to Representative Slagle's concern, providing notice to the potentially impacted landowners. I would assert that that is at the heart of the Wyoming Eminent Domain Act, is providing notice. It is a tool that has been designed to facilitate negotiation. It is a tool that has been created and perfected over the years in the state of Wyoming to create opportunities to get to yes. And if you consider how many different projects have been developed over the past decades under the Wyoming Eminent Domain Act, there is a remarkably tiny number of cases that have actually led to the courtroom where the power of eminent domain or condemnation has been necessary. So how does that work? Well, first of all, you can't take someone's property against their will unless you strictly comply with what the statute requires. And previous legislatures, including as recently as 2007, have gone to great lengths to amend the Eminent Domain Act to add additional protections. So what are those? A project has to truly be in the public interest and necessity. It has to be designed in a manner most compatible with the greatest public good and the least private injury. So in other words, it has to maximize the public benefit. And I would assert that many of these projects, including wind and solar, do just that, creating tremendous revenues for the state and helping the counties and the public at large. But it has to be done in a way to minimize the impact on the private landowners. And then finally, that property sought has to be actually necessary. I can't just take someone's property against their will because I think it's a nice piece of property and it has nothing to do with the overall project. But the big protection and where the balance really takes place is in the requirement for good faith negotiations. If you look at Wyoming Statute 1-26, Section 509, you will see line after line after line of requirements that are imposed upon a company before they can go to the courthouse and even ask to take someone's property. And again, it facilitates negotiation, discussion, and frankly, again, getting to yes. So what are some of those things? Companies are required to provide detailed information about their project in a manner so that the landowner can identify potential impacts, so that the landowner can decide, do I want to oppose this? How is this going to affect my operations? And in that respect, it's very similar to the surface lessee consent forms that you heard Assistant Director Crowder talking about. In other words, you provide as much detail as you can so the landowner can understand how it might impact them. You have to have a minimum of 2 written offer letters. You have to offer to meet in person, walk the property, show them where you're going to be and what you're going to be doing. And you have to, before you can file a lawsuit, you have to establish a security deposit. So that takes out of the equation any of the posers, right? Anyone who might threaten condemnation but not really be willing to back it up. So if I'm going to negotiate with you, Chairman, I'm going to talk to you about what I think is the value of the property. I'm required to do that. I don't get to keep a secret. If I find out that I think your property is worth millions of dollars, I don't get to keep that a secret. And that facilitates discussion, negotiation, and a back and forth. And then ultimately, if I file a suit, I have to put a security deposit equal to the final offer. I have to put skin in the game, so to speak. And then ultimately, there's an additional protection in that if I take a landowner to the courtroom and I cannot prove that I did everything to acquire the rights by good faith negotiation, then I have to pay their attorney fees if they prove that the value of their property was more than 125% of my last offer. So I would assert to the members of this committee that the tools are already in place to address the issues that have been raised today and that appear to be the genesis of this bill. Now, I want to touch on just a few related issues. First, I will respectfully disagree with Commissioner Wade with respect to the authority of eminent domain and whether or not a company seeking to develop either the wind turbines or the related infrastructure have that power. I believe the way that the Eminent Domain Act is drafted and the way that the authority of eminent domain has been granted, I believe that wind companies do have that authority. But what's interesting to note is that even since 2015, even if we just narrow our discussion to the collector systems, let me be very, very clear. I am very familiar with condemnation cases that are filed in the state of Wyoming. I'm not going to say I know every single one of them, but I've searched and I've done as much digging as I could. And since 2015, there has not been a single condemnation filed with respect to collector systems once that moratorium fell off. Now, why is that important? Notice that I did not say the power of eminent domain had not been threatened or that the tools available to both landowners and companies were not utilized. That has happened on numerous occasions, and the act worked. It got to yes to the point that not a single, to my knowledge, condemnation has been filed since 2015 with respect to a collector system. So ultimately, my point is that this is a system that has been developed extensively over decades. It is a system that works. It is a last resort. And more importantly, it is a tool that brings the parties together and does in fact lead to mutually acceptable agreements. Ultimately, I think that at the end of the day, the effort with House Bill 106? I apologize, Mr. Chairman, I couldn't remember. I think ultimately it's attempting to fix what I hear is a single problem. I would assert that's not a proper use of this body's power and authority, But more importantly, I would assert that the act as it stands has all of the tools and all of the incentives necessary to facilitate good faith and appropriate negotiations and discussions. Ultimately, I have not seen this letter that was shared today. I don't know the name of the company, and frankly, I can't say, I don't know details about it. But what I can say is that after nearly 20 years of practice in this area, the system in place works, and it's not the kind of thing that you want to tinker with lightly. With that, I'm happy to respond to questions or inquiries if the committee has, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Questions, committee? Representative Davis?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, this intimate domain, how does that reflect if a private landowner has say a conservation easement on their private ground? How can that actually prevents that from occurring?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Davis, that's an excellent question. Conservation easements do represent a significant obstacle to the development of a property and represent another very significant tool that can be used in land use planning. Generally speaking, it is not an insurmountable obstacle, but it's one that elevates the necessity for good faith negotiation, and particularly the balance that I mentioned, the greatest public good and the least private injury. It elevates that analysis and is a difficult hurdle to overcome in the courtroom. In my experience, the cases that involve conservation easements get to yes even sooner, because that hurdle is so difficult that a company generally recognizes they're not going to want to try to prove it in the courtroom.
Thank you.
Question I'd have for you, John, go ahead. Well, we had this moratorium in place in 2015. Are you aware of what the conditions were that brought the moratorium in the first place? Because it was, I don't know how much before, it only lasted, it was for 5 years, maybe 4 or 5 years. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I believe that is correct. I am not familiar with the actual underlying issues that resulted in the addition of the moratorium to the Eminent Domain Act. I am familiar with ongoing discussions in the larger sense with respect to wind power. And my understanding is that there was, at the time, considerable distaste for wind generation, but that the collector systems that were so carefully identified in the moratorium were sort of the low-hanging fruit, if you will. That was my understanding.
Okay. Representative Winter.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I failed to get your name, but I wanted to ask you a question.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Winter, you failed to get my name because I do not care for testifying in front of committees like this, and I do not completely understand protocol. For that, I apologize. My name is Isaac Sutphin. I am a partner at Holland and Hart here in Cheyenne, Wyoming.
Okay. Well, thank you for being here. But my question and concern goes back to the taxes that these wind farms pay the state of Wyoming. It's my understanding that they do not pay near what gas and oil and coal pay. And so that's my first concern. But the other one is where you're dealing with state land and you got section 16 and 36 in most townships. There's a lot of country in between those sections, and probably several landowners as well. So I think this bill has a lot of merit in that I think that eminent domain is going to be a real issue here with a lot of these ranchers. And I'm not certain that that's the way that this state ought to go.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Winter, thank you. As to your first question about taxes, I apologize, I'm not the guy. I honest to goodness have no idea. I do represent in the eminent domain and condemnation setting all sorts of different companies, including oil and gas and coal and frankly, you name it. But I don't know and can't address that, and I apologize. As to the underlying concern, again, I guess I would respectfully say, Representative Winter, Mr. Chairman, that ultimately a look back at the past several years should tell you everything you need to know. There have been numerous new wind projects that have been developed and brought online since the moratorium came off the books. And in that time, condemnation has not been used in the sense that a case was not filed. Now, does that mean that some landowners around the state have been forced against their will to accept a collector system? I believe the answer to that would be yes, but it has happened through a process of good faith negotiation. And I would remind the committee, in 2007, the Eminent Domain Act was amended to include a different measure of compensation. It's described as comparable easement, or the comparable easement approach to value. That approach has done two things. One, it has directly addressed the concerns that Commissioner Wade raised regarding liability. And the council that Commissioner Wade referred to, I know well, and we have negotiated numerous agreements. And I understand the liability shifting provisions well. That's handled in the compensation out of the 2007 amendments. But ultimately, it has significantly elevated compensation that landowners receive. Post-2007, landowners receive significantly more payment and commensurate with market rates. So ultimately, what I would say is the tools are there already and have been utilized appropriately by the vast majority of companies over the last several years.
So kind of involved in this same, I've asked the question, anybody here can remember why the moratorium went on, the genesis of that? You're free to come forward at some point. Some of this is kind of unusual because in our neck of the woods, people are clamoring to get these wind chargers on their place. It adds significant income to and value to their property. In my case, most of my constituents have had that right removed by the Air Force, who initiated a no-fly zone over all of this area. There were already plans to put in wind farms. And I guess we're here because some kind of required good faith negotiation didn't happen. And we've heard about that. And I'm not sure whether we never got far enough into that process to where that was happening or what. But in response to that, what I just said about the no-fly zone, if we were to pass this, would it limit down what those people in Niobrara County might want, someone who wants a wind farm on their property? How does it affect that? That's what I need to know.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I obviously don't have a crystal ball, but my view of this is that passage of this bill would significantly curtail the negotiations, whether for wind charger systems themselves or for the collector systems. And I think, again, ultimately, the objective of a balanced approach that takes into consideration all landowners' desires and needs is there already. And so if I were a betting man, I would bet that passage of this would lead to abandonment of projects. Now, whether I can say that about the one in Niobrara County or not, I can't be that specific. But if a company with good money behind it wants to come and develop a project like this, they're going to find easier places to do it. That's been my experience.
Representative Schlegel.
Yeah, one question I have. So basically what you're saying is by eliminating the ability or getting rid of the ability to use eminent domain, it makes for better negotiation. Is that what you're saying?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Slagle, precisely, that's precisely what I'm saying. And it sounds counterintuitive. In many circles, condemnation and eminent domain is a four-letter word, and I recognize that. And I've gone to great lengths throughout my career to try to alleviate that misconception. Essentially, as projects come together and are developed, negotiations naturally take place. And certainly, this bill will not change what happens in many, many negotiations. But ultimately, especially when you have projects that involve the missing piece of the puzzle, so to speak, without this tool bringing the landowners and the developers together, you end up with that last piece of the puzzle, that last mile, which may be in the middle of the project, and a single landowner can arbitrarily or with good reason shut down the development entirely. And that's the imbalance that the Eminent Domain Act alleviates.
Further questions? Yes, Representative Slagle.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Deppen. The question I would have, Commissioner Wade brought up the example of the pipeline. If I understand right, that One Oaks pipeline came down through all the way from Montana to Oklahoma and avoided public land all the way down because they didn't want to have to deal with the federal government. And I guess what I see is if they're willing to come down and avoid government land because they don't want to deal with them, how come can't private landowners have that same right by not having eminent domain be able to be used against them?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Slagle, first let me clarify, although I was involved in both One Oak pipeline projects, I'm not here testifying on behalf of One Oak. And the lawyer in me insists on clarifying that point. Ultimately, having personal knowledge of those projects, I can tell you that the alignment was the result of many, many years of study and evaluation. And it was not simply an effort to avoid federal or even state property. But ultimately, to your point, Representative, the tools that are available to a developer depend upon the nature of the landowner. For example, to the chairman's comment, condemnation ain't a thing with respect to the federal government. And for that matter, it ain't a thing with respect to the state, right? It is the power of the sovereign and therefore cannot be used against the sovereign. But it has been delegated through the Constitution and through the Eminent Domain Act for precisely this type of scenario. And again, represents the balance that that everyone requires. So ultimately, yeah, the landowner loses certain rights, but in exchange is given additional notice and compensation provisions as an added protection. And ultimately, Representative, it represents not just the balance, but the decision that some projects, assuming they can meet all of the elements of the act, are so important for the furtherance of our state's purposes that they need to be allowed to proceed over a single landowner's objection.
I'm sorry. I think we'll go ahead and move on to further public testimony if we could. Thank you. Come on up, Jim. Are you going to help me remember why we put it on that one a few years back?
I'm not sure my memory is better than yours, but I do have definitely some history and recollection with regard to this. Mr. Chairman, Jim McGagnon with the Wyoming Stockgrowers Association again, and I was very involved back in 2010 working with then Representative Kermit Brown in developing this original statute. And the scenario you faced then, it was in the very beginning days of wind energy development in Wyoming. As I recall, most of that was in Goshen, Niobrara County, that area of the state. And what we had wind energy companies doing, at least one company, was negotiating a final agreement with a landowner to put wind towers on their land, lucrative payments that were attractive to the landowner, without even approaching the neighboring landowners about the need for access for the collector systems, and then using the threat of eminent domain to try and get those for little or no compensation. When this bill was passed, it was agreed by all of us that we should do it for a very short term. In fact, initially it was for 2 years. And the idea being that that would give the industry and the landowner community and others the opportunity to sit down and perhaps develop a process that would be more conducive to doing this in a user-friendly manner. That didn't happen. The legislation was then extended for 2 more years to 2015. And by the end of that period of time, wind energy development had rather ceased in Wyoming. There wasn't much happening. So none of us made the effort to extend it any further beyond that, although the development of any protocols never really took place. In more recent years, of course, we're seeing a lot of wind energy development, and I'm familiar with a number of scenarios. I think I would have to say, for the most part, the wind energy companies have been very good in sitting down and negotiating with landowners for their collector lines. Often, in at least some that I'm aware of, not finalizing a deal with a landowner to locate the towers on them until they had also reached an agreement with other neighboring landowners for the collector lines with, in some cases, some significant payments for that. So that has helped. I'm also aware of at least one case where a landowner who was offered a very lucrative agreement to put the wind towers on his land got together with his neighbors, and they mutually agreed that he would not accept that until the proponent had negotiated appropriate agreements with the neighboring landowners for the collector system. So I would have to say that in recent years, from my experience, I think the process has worked very well without the use of actual eminent domain, as the previous speaker pointed out. I think the case that's being mentioned here today brings a whole different factor forward. Obviously, perhaps there isn't good faith negotiation, but the other factor is that was not involved in those early cases is the fact that state land is involved. And where a landowner can be sensitive to saying, I want a negotiation that takes care of my neighbors as well, I think the state lands in carrying out their obligations as raising revenue is not likely to do that if they've got a good agreement they can sign, that it may get signed without any regard for what the impacts may be on neighboring landowners where the collector lines need to be located. So for that reason, I can see this particular case points to the need to assure that eminent domain isn't inappropriately used. And we would, for that reason, support the bill, but I would suggest for your consideration that maybe if you do choose to extend this, that it be done on a much shorter time frame once again, and perhaps would provide the tool to work through this scenario, perhaps to develop some guidance for how state would deal with state land leases for wind energy. But I frankly could see a downside to a full 10-year extension at this point in time when the process in general seems to be working reasonably well. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Questions, committee?
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for your history on that moratorium. I appreciate it. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Shannon Anderson on behalf of Powder River Basin Resource Council. I have with me my colleague Claire Duder, who's new to our organization, and I just wanted to introduce you to her as well. Our organization, and on behalf of our members who are family farmers and ranchers across the state, we did support the original legislation that put in place a moratorium on eminent domain for these collector line systems. We supported the extensions to that provision in law, and we support the bill that's before you today. I think one thing that hasn't come up yet in your discussion is that this is limited to what are called independent power producers. So there's a specific piece of this statute that does not apply to public utilities. So if you are a public utility, you're serving customers in the state, you receive what's called a Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity from the Public Service Commission, you still have the right to use eminent domain. And that's because you are serving the public. You're providing power to the people of the state. This particular statutory provision and the limitation on eminent domain is limited to, again, those companies that are coming into Wyoming that aren't actually serving customers within the state. That they are, they're negotiating and they're building turbines and they're not necessarily serving customers in Wyoming. I would also note through the benefit of your discussion, it was just mentioned previously in testimony that maybe eminent domain and condemnation hasn't been used in wind projects lately. It's still present in every single negotiation. So whether or not you actually use eminent domain, there's always that threat when you're negotiating as a landowner that it could be used against you. And that is the thumb of the state on the scale in your negotiations. So in order to really protect your private property, sometimes you take a deal that you wouldn't take otherwise because you know that eminent domain is there and present. So even if it's not used, it's always there. And it's a factor in negotiations and helps to prevent landowners from really receiving the value that they should receive for their private property. And then the other thing I would just mention is, as many of you are aware, there's a whole complex body around condemnation. There's provisions of condemnation that are afforded in the Constitution. There's some in the statutory condemnation. Transmission is a statutory right of condemnation. And again, particularly here, we're dealing with collector lines, which aren't like the big lines that you see out on the landscape. They're the smaller lines that go from the turbines to kind of a substation sort of situation. And again, independent power providers, smaller collector lines. It's really important to be able to have landowners protect their rights and to be able to fairly negotiate with companies that are coming into the state. So with that, we support the bill. Happy to provide context back in the yonder years, but it was really partly a converse in Natrona County. There were some issues there as well. So in the Laramie Range is really where that bill kind of came from, but yeah.
Questions, committee? Okay, thank you. Oh, Representative Schlegel, go ahead.
One question I'd have for you, Ms. Anderson. So you would see this bill actually allowing, especially in case of this project where most of these projects are being developed on state land, the state being able to say with the use of condemnation, we need to have these transmission lines in there. Is that what you were saying?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Slagle, it's really, once you kind of get access from a landowner, whether it's a state or another private party, then the state's power of eminent domain transferred to that private company does put the thumb on the scale in the negotiations on these collector lines.
Thank you.
You indicated that the collector lines are just small transmission lines from the, I understood that this line could be a major line that goes all the way through a county, catching state sections. Am I misunderstanding what we're talking about with collector lines?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I would refer you to the definition that's in the statute before you. There is a description of what these collector line systems are.
Okay, any other questions? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Further public testimony, Mr. Moline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brett Moline, Wyoming Farm Bureau Federation, sitting in support of this bill. We have to look what the bill does. It limits for collector lines the power for companies to use eminent domain until 2032. That's what this bill does. There's been a lot of other issues brought up that are kind of outside the realm of this bill, but I want to say this, right now, the playing field isn't level. When the other side, through the power of eminent domain, has the biggest hammer in the closet, in the toolbox, that's big. So by taking this out, it helps out the private landowners. There's going to be winners and losers. But in my opinion, on this case, it's going to be the private landowners will be the winners. Give them more power of negotiation, being able to fetch a better return on their investment on their private land. With that, Mr. Chairman, sitting in support of the bill, I would sit for any questions you may have.
Questions, committee? Thank you.
Thank you.
Further public testimony? Seeing none, committee, what's your pleasure? I'll close public testimony, and what's your pleasure, committee? Been moved by Representative Conrad. Seconded by Slagle. Discussion on the bill? Yes, Representative Banks.
I'd just like to say I appreciate all the testimony that's been shared with us today. And as far as the ability to negotiate, and we heard that phrase a lot today. And I think this bill gives us the better power to negotiate. When the threat of eminent domain is taken off the table, then you're forced to go and find the best negotiation that you can find and find the best deal that everybody's gonna win on, without saying, well, I'm the government and I have eminent domain, now it's done. We have to come together. And so I support the bill and vote aye.
Other discussion? Yes, Representative Alleman.
Mr. Chairman, it looks to me like the state is pitting themselves against the people of Niobrara and Goshen County. Otherwise, it just looks like the state's not going to require the benefits that the private ranchers want. Otherwise, we wouldn't have Mr. Wade, Mr. Slagle, two very important representative of the people. They would not be here if the people did not want them here. So I am going to say I am very strongly in favor of this bill. Thank you.
I might defend this state lands. They have a process. They have a process that they go through, and this was in initial stages. They didn't agree with the way the wind farm or the wind people that went into it. Anyway, I don't know as they're pitted against the people of Wyoming, but it may look that way. I guess I didn't view it that way. A question I have for the bringer. How long, so we've got quite a number of years here, 10 years basically. How long do you think it would take if we put this moratorium in place for a period of time? I'm trying to help the bill so that it may pass. These arguments are going to be going to a large body of people. Can you, do you think the issues would be resolved to where the moratorium would no longer be needed? Can you have an idea of that, Alan?
Well, that's the 10 years is the number I came up with, like I explained earlier, because that's the time frame when they thought it'd be the development of the company. But I guess I would say we could do it for a shorter amount of time if it'd be more favorable to some of the people that are opposed to this bill. I mean, I don't know. I guess I'm open for recommendations from the committee.
Oh, Representative Banks.
I, just as a personal note, would like to see the time frame longer because I don't think these issues are going away anytime soon. But I think 10 years is a good start. that allows us to see things through and maybe get the project going and underway. And if the bringer thinks that that's how long it's going to take for the project to be so that our landowners are protected in that area, I would say we stick with the 10 years on there.
Representative Davis?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple of questions I needed to in my mind, clear up. What tools are available at the county level, to control this, through the planning and zoning, if those have been investigated, And then another thing out there, as we all know, is the grouse issue. Is this I'm sure, not being familiar with the county up there, is there core area or anything like that needs to be looked at? And the other thing is this site specific? Because if I read this right, this has state ramifications throughout the whole state, not just these two counties up there. So we're looking at the rest of the state of putting a moratorium on. And then I too would like to revisit that, if this should go through, the 10-year deal, because as Mr. Magagna pointed out, it was taken up earlier in smaller increments of a couple of years so they could work through this. And we can always come back and revisit this legislation to extend that time period, et cetera, et cetera. That's my comments on it.
Representative Alleman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We can also come back and revisit it if we set it too long. I agree with Mr. Banks. I would like to see it longer, but I will accept the 10 years. And if the 10 years is too long, we can come back and revisit it and cut it down if the problem no longer exists. Thank you.
Representative Schlegel?
Mr. Chairman, committee, one comment I would have is in dealing with oil companies doing surface use agreements with them, a lot of times those agreements have taken me 2 to 3 years to work through to where we come up with an agreement. If we set this at 2 years and the wind company is willing to wait that long, then we're out of the option. We don't have the protection of no eminent domain. Then eminent domain is back on the table and our negotiating power has just gone down. I mean, so I don't know. I guess that's one comment I would say.
Okay. Well, seeing no motions to amend, I guess a concern I have with the bill is we'll come back next year and have a set of constituents upset that we put the moratorium on and they can't build a wind farm in Niobrara County. That hasn't been addressed very well, but I'm guessing there are folks there that might be planning differently than we're trying to address here. Yeah, Representative Schlegel, you're more familiar with it. Help me out.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I guess what I would say is I don't think this is going to limit a wind farm from being developed in Niobrara County. The thing, anybody that wants to develop one can, and like I brought out with the One Oaks pipeline, they skirted all federal land when they came down through with their pipeline. And if they want to develop a wind farm, there are ways to go around, unless all the landowners on just all the sides of a particular landowner wanting to develop the wind farm are opposed to it. There are ways to get it out, and that's where if this eminent domain deal is in place, the wind farm has to work with those landowners to build the distribution lines going out from that area.
Representative Davis.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to offer up an amendment to the bill on page 2, line 4, in there where it says generating electricity from wind and solar. I'd like to insert and solar. And then page 2, line 6, I'd like to put that June 30th of 2028. in the interest of moving this bill forward.
Okay. Do we have a second on that motion? Been seconded by Allred. Any discussion? Yes, Representative Craigo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Speaking specifically about the addition of the word solar, I'm just worried we're going to run into a single subject objection when we get to the floor, and we'll have a rules committee because it's outside the bill title. Adding the word solar is going to create open a whole nother can of worms that we probably don't want to mess with. Yes, sir.
I kind of agree, it could jeopardize the bill.
With that, Mr. Chairman, I would pull my amendment and re-amend to line 6, just the date to 2028.
Okay, would the second be okay with that? Yes. All right, so we just have the date change of 2028. Any discussion on the amendment? Representative Winter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What reasoning do you have, Representative Davis, for backing that date off?
To see what the ramifications are by the enactment of this legislation statewide with the other projects that could be coming forth in the state, since this isn't just site-specific.
Representative Almond.
I look at it as if it's a problem in one area, it's probably a problem in all areas. And the bill is not just for Niobrara County, it will protect the people in Natrona County and Johnson County also. And that's the way I look at it. I don't think it's area specific. I think it's a statewide problem. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, Representative Banks.
Just real quick, I would agree. I think that I know personally people in my district who are heavily worried about the continuing limiting of private property rights. And so to move the date down, I would say and expose them further if we have to continue to come back and look at this. I'm from the perspective, I don't think there's gonna be any negative ramifications of it. I mean, it's gonna force people to negotiate and talk to each other. And if there's something we've seen through a lot of processes, people need to come together and talk to each other. And so if we get 10 years out of this where they have to do that, I see that as a very positive thing. So I would be against the amendment.
Okay, any further discussion? Sensing we're ready to vote, all those in favor of changing the date to 2028, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
Okay, I'm not sure. Raise your hands. All those in favor, raise your hands. Okay, well, I can't hear very well. I kind of knew that. My wife will attest, I don't hear some things. All right. Opposed? Okay, that amendment fails. Any further discussion on the bill? Okay, sensing we're ready to vote, we're voting on House Bill 106. Roll call.
Representative Allemand?
Aye.
Representative Allred?
Aye.
Representative Banks?
Aye.
Representative Conrad?
No.
Representative Craigo?
Aye.
Representative Davis?
No.
Representative Slagle?
Aye.
Representative Winter?
Aye.
Chairman Eklund?
I don't know. Aye. It's going to pass anyway, but
I think this
We
time
may-
I can
we may
count
look at
right,
some-
and the
okay, what?
ayes are yes, and noes are two.
Okay, all right. if we take a 5-minute break, I believe we'll still have time for a very quick bill afterwards, and I think we need to take that break. So 5 minutes, and this time I mean it. I vote nay. I think we have everybody. Bill's not here. There he is. Well, we're all here. Our next bill for consideration is House Bill 79. Representative Craigo, go ahead and explain your bill.
Thank you,
Quickly,
Mr.
if
Chairman.
possible.
I'll roll through it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee members. I bring to you House Bill 79, ask for your favorable consideration. This is a bill that came to me from a constituent back home, wanted to know why he could not use his concealed carry permit as a valid voter ID. I said, I have no idea. That's a great question. We'll look into it. And so the answer is, it's just not one of those listed, obviously, within the statute. And so this is just an attempt to add that. I think it's a good addition, a good fix to our voter ID bill that passed a couple years ago. I have talked to the Secretary of State about this bill, and I'm sure he'll come testify, but I think they're generally in support. They'd like to see a simple amendment. I mean, when we get on to page 2, lines 10 and 11, which is really the meat of the bill, obviously, they're worried about 68104, which is a statutory reference to concealed carry, and we have reciprocity provisions within that. And the Secretary of State's office is worried that people would be using their out-of-state concealed carries to vote, and we don't want that to happen. So I think at some point, we just need to add an amendment in before the word pursuant. It would just say issued by the state of Wyoming pursuant to Wyoming statute 68104, just to make it very clear that we're only talking about Wyoming issued concealed carry permits. No permits or licenses from out of state can be used for voting purposes. And I think that's a good cleanup. And I will say on the Senate side, they struck the reference to the statute and just said permit issued by the state of Wyoming. But I'd just soon, as a lawyer, I'd like to keep the statutory reference in there so it's very clear that which statute we're actually talking about, not just some random permit issued by the state of Wyoming. And I don't think it muddies the waters at all. I think it's a good amendment. And when we get to that point, I'd ask for that to be brought. And with that, I will allow for public testimony, Mr. Chairman.
Any questions for the bill's sponsor? Yes, Representative
Mr.
Conrad.
Chairman and Representative Craigo, is there any reason we wouldn't put a valid Wyoming permit to carry a concealed? Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Conrad, we could do that. I was just responding to the request by our good Secretary of State to fix the problem. That was kind of the request they had made, and so I'm fine with that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Further testimony? Okay.
Thank you, Chairman Eklund. I'm Chuck Ray, the Wyoming Secretary of State, and then to my right is Joe Rubino, our Policy Director and General Counsel. To my left is Jesse Naiman, our Chief Deputy. I stand in support of House Bill 79, including within the acceptable identification, a Wyoming concealed firearm permit provides a common sense balance which allows a form of acceptable identification to vote, which is strong. It doesn't compromise election integrity at all. You know, I look through the list and I see a couple things, you know, having shepherded through that bill that frankly I would have liked to take off, and I still would like to take off, but this is one I would like to add. And so I'm very supportive of this bill. Our one concern, as Representative Craigo said, and there's a Senate counterpart to this bill that went through Senate Corp here last week, is ensuring that that it's a Wyoming concealed carry. And, you know, I'm all for the reciprocity. This isn't getting into that issue, that policy decision. That's great. But for the purposes of identification, for purposes of voting, we think it's good to clarify that it's a Wyoming ID. We do have an amendment. You want to pass that out? I know Representative Craigo also laid out his, and I'm fine with his. The only difference, and ours is identical to the one adopted by the Senate, is that we delete the statutory reference in this amendment that's handed out, and the Senate did that. That was actually there, you know, Senator Landon kind of And my preference is to delete the statutory reference. We get a whole debate. You know, there is a reference in the statutory reference to reciprocity, and I understand Representative Crago's point. It doesn't reference the issuing of it. And when you say by the state of Wyoming, it's pretty clear. But, you know, I think no matter how you do it, an argument could be made. It would be an outrageous argument, but either way, an attorney could make the argument. I think the intent's pretty clear. I think it would definitely, you know, be an absurd argument, but my preference would be to delete the statutory reference, but I understand and respect Representative Crago that he wants that in there. Either way, let's make it clear that it's a Wyoming permit. That would be appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Thank you. Any further testimony? Okay, we'll close the testimony. Oops, we do have something. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm not looking very well. I'm in a hurry. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I'll be really short. My name is Mary Langford, and I have the honor of representing the county clerks of the state of Wyoming. We support this piece of legislation because we were approached during the election season last year, and folks presented concealed carry permits or their licenses, as a form of ID, as a form of a Wyoming ID. And this will clarify that. As far as an amendment, leaving the site in or out, we just want clarity is all. So we would appreciate, it being able to testify today and support the bill. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to stand for those.
Thank you. Any questions? Thank you. Further testimony. Committee, what's your pleasure?
Move the bill.
And moved by Davis, seconded by Slagle. Discussion on the bill.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Representative Conrad.
with respect to Secretary of State Gray, are we going to amend as denoted page 2, line 10, and also page 2, line 11, before the bill is agreed upon?
Yes, I think we probably should. Somebody needs to,
I'll make a motion, Mr. Chairman, that on, well, this is not my amendment, so I can't do, as discussion purposes, Mr. Chairman, I don't know why, and I appreciate Secretary of State Gray's component was it relates to deleting the issued pursuant. Was that based specifically on the Senate side? I apologize, Mr.
it was
Chairman.
deleted on the Senate side, if I understood things correctly.
Okay, then with that being said, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I will make the amendment, or more importantly, I will make a motion to approve the amendment as given to us by Secretary of State. That on page 2, line 10, after valid permit, we insert issued by the state of Wyoming.
Okay,
And lastly, on page 2, line 11, after firearm, delete issued pursuant to Wyoming Statute 68104.
okay, any discussion? Oh, let's see, is there a second? Seconded by Davis. Is there any discussion on this amendment? Yes, Representative Winter.
I'd just like to know from Representative Crago if that's okay with him.
Mr. Chairman, as I said, I don't think it's going to matter. As a lawyer, I like to leave the statutory reference in so it's very clear where that authority to issue the permit comes from, which is that exact statute. I'm not worried about the reciprocity argument, especially if we add in the words issued by the state of Wyoming. I think we take away that reciprocity at that point is gone because we're saying it has to be a permit issued by the state of Wyoming. That being said, I'm fine with the amendment as presented by the Secretary of State. It's not a big deal. This is really one of those personal preference deals. And so whatever gets the bill to the finish line and helps the people of Wyoming, I am good with. So I don't take any personal pride in authorship.
Okay, all those in favor of the amendment say aye.
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 Opposed? The amendment passes. Any further discussion on the bill? Roll call on House Bill 79.
Representative Alleman.
Aye.
Representative Allred.
Aye.
Representative Banks.
Aye.
Representative Conrad,
Aye.
Representative Crago,
Aye.
Representative Davis,
Aye.
Representative Slagle,
Aye.
Representative Winter,
Aye.
Chairman Eklund.
Aye.
Ayes are 9, noes are 0. Do pass with amendments.
Okay.